Recording in progress.
एक सुगंध हृदय से छनकर निशब्द चारों ओर छाई। एक सुगंध हृदय से छनकर निशब्द चारों ओर छाई। हे माता तेरा नाम लेकर करें हम सब की भलाई। हे माता तेरा नाम लेकर करें हम सब की भलाई। एक सुगंध हृदय से छनकर हृदय चाहे खुद को उजाड़ सब में बांटे बेहिसाब। ये बनना चाहे माँ के हाथों, ये बनना चाहे माँ के हाथों एक सहज खुली किताब। एक सुगंध हृदय से छनकर निशब्द चारों ओर छाई। हे माता तेरा नाम लेकर करें हम सब की भलाई। हम नाम धाम कुछ भी न मांगे, हम मांगे बस तेरा सानिध्य। हम इतना जाने इतना माने, हम इतना जाने इतना माने, माँ तू ही है परम सत्य। एक सुगंध हृदय से छनकर निशब्द चारों ओर छाई। हे माता तेरा नाम लेकर करें हम सब की भलाई। एक सुगंध हृदय से छनकर निशब्द चारों ओर छाई।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. This भजन इस एक सुगंध हृदय से छनकर निशब्द होकर चारों ओर छाई. The presence of the divine is a sort of a fragrance, and the fragrance has a way of diffusing. It doesn't have clear-cut boundaries, and our perception, human perception of even the infinite or this type of a limitless fragrance is through the filter of the mind. That is the instrument that we use for perceiving everything, including the divine. But then the effect of this fragrance is that it spreads to every nook and corner of the body, and that is what the seeker actually aspires for, It should reach every nook and corner of the body so that every bit of us, every part of the being gets transformed. And one of the effects of that transformation, which was mentioned repeatedly in this bhajan, is being good to everybody, goodness. Let's do good to all those around us and do it without any calculation, behisab, without any considerations of give and take. I've received this much, so I should give this much. That is not the type of calculation that goes into what is given out of love. There's a little story of a shopkeeper who had two customers in front of him, a little girl and a seeker. And the girl had come first, so he served her first. She asked for some nuts for a certain amount of money. He just picked up a fistful of nuts and put them in her bag. The seeker, who was the second customer, watched it and he asked the shopkeeper, she gave you only a very small amount of money and you've given such a fistful of nuts to her. He said, I love this girl, and in love there is no calculation, there's no counting. So the seeker was taken aback. He said, I think at least I feel that I'm a great devotee of God, but I do keep some sort of an account. When I have a rosary in my hand, I'm counting all the time, and I feel, well, 108 times is over, so that's enough for now. So I do keep a count of it. So I should learn something from this man. If I truly love the Lord, I should dispense with that sort of accounting, that sort of counting. Now, turning to today's class, which is about the physiology of blood. Blood is something so intimate to us that we use it often in language, like, say, teaching is in my blood. What I mean is that my father was a very good teacher. Probably that's why I can teach well. But then we know that scientifically, we don't really inherit qualities through the blood, it is through genes. Then, in the same way, when uh, we ask for a great sacrifice or we make a great sacrifice, it's thought in terms of blood. Like Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose said, give me blood and I'll give you freedom. So that is considered the highest sort of a sacrifice because of the importance that we attach to blood. And in fact, the ancients, when they observed that when the blood stops flowing, the person dies, concluded that probably life resides in blood. And in a way, it does, because we have seen that for staying alive, the cells of our body, all the cells of our body, should be surrounded by a fluid which is suitably wet, warm, and salty, and should have food available, should not have an accumulation of waste products, and so on. And this is achieved in spite of a very small amount of fluid surrounding the trillions of our cells, because this fluid is in intimate contact with the blood, and it is the blood from where the nutrition comes, the oxygen comes, and into which the waste products are dumped. And this blood is not stationary, it is flowing. And that's how the cells are able to get the type of conditions under which they can live. So that is the great contribution that blood makes to the body by transporting food and oxygen towards the cells and taking away from the cells their waste products. So essentially, the function of blood is transport. It's like a flowing river, and it brings something that we need and takes away what the cells don't need. Now let me turn to the digital board. Blood has two components, broadly speaking: the fluid, which we call plasma, and cells, approximately half-half. And when it comes to the cells, one type of cells are the red blood cells. The red blood cells, if we look at a red blood cell from the side, it is somewhat like this, which means that the center is thinner and the periphery is thicker. And this seems to be a great advantage because under some conditions, the cells might swell, and this leaves scope for swelling without bursting. On the other hand, you can imagine that if it was already like this, as happens in some diseases like spherocytosis, this cell, if it swells a bit, it is likely to burst. Apart from this, probably this shape also gives the advantage that it can squeeze through very narrow capillaries, some of which may be just about the same or slightly smaller in diameter than the red blood cell itself. And therefore, it can bend and squeeze through those blood vessels without any problem. So it's a very beautifully constructed cell. But however, it hardly looks like a cell because it has no nucleus. Uh, it's a bag of hemoglobin. About 1/3 of it is hemoglobin, and 2/3 is water, and some salts, etc., dissolved in that water. But then to start with, it is a cell with a nucleus and everything. The red cells are manufactured in the bone marrow, and to start with, they start as cells which have the potential of forming a large variety of blood cells, including red cells, and these cells multiply very fast. These are undifferentiated, but just have the potential of forming blood cells. Then, it distinguishes itself, differentiates itself, so that it still continues to divide, but now it has committed itself to forming a red blood cell. It's not totipotent anymore. Now it has committed itself to forming a red blood cell. It continues to multiply and differentiate, and as it differentiates more, it starts manufacturing hemoglobin, but it still has a nucleus. And then it multiplies further and differentiates further and eventually gets rid of the nucleus. The nucleus is lost. And that is when it becomes a proper red blood cell and is sent into the circulation. But then it's able to live for a limited period of time, even without the nucleus, but not for very long. And therefore, its life is rather limited, about 3 months. So a red cell lives about 3 months, which means that then it is destroyed, and there are places in the body where it is destroyed and the debris can be taken care of. And the dead cells are replaced by the new cells that are formed. That happens all over the body. So that applies also to the red blood cells. The second category of cells are the white blood cells. And they come in a large variety. One variety of red blood cells have a multi-lobed nucleus which means the nucleus has multiple lobes, and it has fine purplish granules in the cytoplasm. And this type of cells are called neutrophils. Or polymorphs. Another type have a nucleus that is generally bilobed, and the granules in this type of cell are larger, not as thin as in the neutrophils, and they are reddish in color. These are the cells that are called eosinophils. And then you have yet another category of cells with granules in their cytoplasm. And these cells have a fragmented nucleus, 2 or 3 fragments of the nucleus. And then the cell has a large number of thick granules, bluish in color, which are jam-packed. No, the cell is jam-packed with these granules to the extent that the nucleus may be covered with these granules. And these are the cells that are called the basophils. So when you see your blood report and you find the percentage of different types of white blood cells, the neutrophils or the polymorphs, eosinophils and basophils, you know what they look like under the microscope. And why they have been given these names is because the commonest stain, that is the coloring chemical with which the blood film is stained before you look at it under the microscope, has acidic and basic dyes. The acidic dye is reddish in color, and the granules which take up that acidic dye, eosin, are called eosinophils because their granules have an affinity for this acidic dye and eosin, and therefore they acquire this reddish color. And the basophils have granules which have an affinity for the blue dye, the hematoxylin, and the neutrophils probably pick up a bit of both, and that's how they acquire a purplish color. So the names, all neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, are based on the type of affinity that their granules have for the different types of dyes which are used commonly for staining these cells. And because these cells have granules in their cytoplasm, they are called granulocytes. So this is one category of white blood cells. Then there is another category which does not have these granules. And these are of two varieties, the two types of cells that do not have granules. One type of these cells without granules in their cytoplasm have a nucleus that is bilobed, but not like that of an eosinophil. It is somewhat kidney-shaped. So this is the nucleus. And in cytoplasm, there are no granules. And these are the cells which are called monocytes. And these are the cells that migrate from the blood into the tissues and become phagocytes. Phagocytes are cells which can eat up something, so they can eat up germs and other foreign substances. The other type of cells without granules have a nucleus which is very big. It occupies almost the entire cell, leaving behind only a thin rim of cytoplasm. And these cells are called lymphocytes. And because these cells have no granules, they are the agranulocytes. Now, how much of these cells are you? There's still one more variety of cells, and I'm sure one of you would have pointed out if I didn't talk about it before going any further. And because these are the cells that we hear about a lot these days, in situations like the dengue fever, their count goes down, the platelets. The platelets are rather small. They are not proper cells, they are fragments of cells. They originate in the bone marrow like the other blood cells from a very huge cell called the megakaryocyte, mega because very big. And as it develops, it fragments into these platelets. And although, like the red cells, again, they don't have a nucleus, they are virtual laboratories with a very large number of chemicals which participate in the hemostatic process, that is checking bleeding after we have a wound. And these are the platelets. Now, how much of these cells do we have in our blood? The count is generally expressed in terms of a cubic millimeter or a microliter. They both come to the same thing. Micro means 1 millionth part, 10 raised to the power minus 6, and milli is 1000, 10 raised to the power minus 3. So whether it's cubic millimeter or microliter, it comes to the same thing. Let's stick to the simpler one, cubic millimeter. Now, what does cubic millimeter mean? Cubic millimeter means a cube, the space occupied by a cube, each side of which is 1 millimeter. So this is 1 millimeter. So this cube is 1 cubic millimeter and comes to the same as 1 microliter. Now, why I'm making this is because it's an extremely small volume, about the size of a pinhead. Now, within this small space, we have packed red blood cells to the tune of about 5 million, which is 5 into 10 raised to the power 6. White blood cells, 4,000 to 11,000, or that is the range, but say for simplicity, let's put 5,000. Five into 10 raised to the power 3. And platelets, about 2 lakhs. 1 lakh is 10 raised to the power 5. So 2 multiplied by 10 raised to the power 5. So the simple way to think of it is that the red blood cells are in terms of millions, white blood cells thousands, and platelets lakhs. So that is the number of these cells in such a small volume as 1 cubic millimeter. Now with this, now I'll switch to the PowerPoint. Once again, let to go to the sharing. Stop sharing. The YES project is a part of the 150th anniversary celebration of Sri Aurobindo and 75 years of independence. So as we saw, blood has plasma and cells. The fluid part is plasma and into which are suspended the cells. And the plasma is a fluid that, apart from salts, all salts or electrolytes, also has a significant amount of proteins. And these proteins include albumin, globulins, which are antibodies, clotting proteins, that is, proteins that participate in the clotting of blood, and a variety of hormones, and binding proteins. The binding proteins are those, which bind small molecules like hormones which have small molecules, so that they don't get lost here and there, and they can be released at the right place where the receptors for that hormone are available. It's something like, holding the hand of a child so that the child is safely taken to school or wherever you are taking the child and doesn't get lost on the way. So that is the function of the binding proteins. In general, one can say that plasma, in fact, transports just about everything that needs to go in the body from one place to another. And therefore, it serves as a mirror for what is going on in the body. And that is why when we do the blood tests, you can measure so many things like cholesterol or vitamin D levels or vitamin B12 levels, iron levels, calcium levels. Now, all these things give us an idea of the state of affairs in the rest of the body, because in a way, blood mirrors what is happening in the rest of the body because it is circulating all over the body. And in fact, the fluids of the body, both within the cell and outside the cell, are directly or indirectly in communication with the fluid in the blood, that is the plasma. Now, sometimes you would have heard that we talk in terms of plasma and sometimes terms of serum. Now, what is the difference between the two? If blood is left to clot, then the fluid still oozes out from the clump of cells that has formed the clot, and this fluid that oozes out is the serum. So plasma minus clotting proteins is what we call serum. That is the difference between the two. And why both are used is because in some tests, serum is more suitable, in some plasma is okay. But the main thing is that these are the blood levels of the substances that we get, whether you measure in the plasma or in the serum. Now, cells are of three types, as we saw. The red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. Erythro means red. White blood cells, leukocytes. Leuko means white. And platelets are called thrombocytes because they participate in the process of thrombosis or clotting. They can help in forming a clot. The function of the red blood cells is to bind oxygen. They are essentially a bag containing hemoglobin. And hemoglobin has a great affinity for oxygen. And we need oxygen all over the body in all the cells. This oxygen is transported by hemoglobin. If hemoglobin were not there, only a very small amount would dissolve in the plasma. But it is because of the hemoglobin that we are able to carry a much larger amount of oxygen transported from one place to another. When there's a reduction in the hemoglobin in the blood, which could be either because the number of red cells has gone down or because the cells have very little hemoglobin inside, that is, red cells have less hemoglobin than normal, the hemoglobin levels would come down. Now, as the hemoglobin level comes down, the capacity of the blood to transport will go down. And when the capacity of the blood to transport goes down, the reserve that we have for drawing upon extra oxygen in, say, the situations like exercise, that goes down, which means that the person then can't take exercise. He gets tired very easily, and that's what happens in anemia. So for a person who's getting easily tired, one of the reasons could be that the person has anemia. Now, what is it that leads to anemia? What are the causes of anemia? Logically, you can understand that it could be either because of reduced production of the red blood cells, or increased destruction, or abnormal losses of blood. Now let's look at these three one by one. One of the reasons for reduction in the hemoglobin levels, which means the reduction in the red cells, could be the reduced production of red blood cells. They're not being made in sufficient number. So there's a factory in the bone marrow which is manufacturing the red cells, but then the bone marrow needs some raw materials for manufacturing the red cells. And if this raw material is not enough, if some essential item is missing, just one item could make all the difference, and the production would go down. And some of the critical materials which may be deficient are iron, folic acid, and vitamin B12. Iron deficiency anemia is the commonest type of anemia in India, and folic acid deficiency is also fairly common, especially in pregnant women. But vitamin B12 deficiency, luckily, is extremely rare. These three different types of anemia can be distinguished one from the other. But very often the clinical approach is that if the person has anemia, you go a bit of all the three. So that's why you find that many tablets have all these three together: iron, folic acid, and vitamin B12. The second reason why the production could be reduced is that everything is okay, the raw material is available, but the workers are on strike. Now that is what we call an aplastic anemia. That is, the cells which manufacture red blood cells have stopped working. And that can happen in some situations. And this is one of those dreaded situations where we don't really know what to do, because there's no sure shot mechanism by which we can kickstart and sort of resolve this strike and make sure that they will start working again. So it's just essentially a question of wait and watch. But it's not a very common condition, luckily. But when it happens, it is one of the dreaded conditions. The second situation, or second reason for anemia could be that the red cells are being destroyed at a faster rate. The normal lifespan of a red cell is about 120 days or 4 months. But when they are destroyed in much larger numbers, the production may not be able to keep pace with it, and the person therefore develops anemia. And once again, the destruction could be due to two reasons. Either the red cells themselves are defective, as happens in thalassemia, or they're surrounded by some toxic chemicals, as in case of some drugs, which can lead to increased destruction of red cells when there's an adverse effect of the drug, and snake venoms. Some snake venoms also increase the destruction of the red cells. So essentially, the increased destruction may be because the red cells themselves are weak, they're diseased and defective. That happens in thalassemia, or because of antisocial elements in the surroundings. Then the third, abnormal losses. Abnormal losses may be considered as excessive immigration, emigration, that is migrating out. Migrating out in larger numbers. And these abnormal losses, some of the common situations where abnormal losses of blood may lead to anemia are heavy menstrual loss in women, piles, and hookworm infestation. Hookworms, are in the intestines, and they are called hookworms because they have tiny little hooks by which they can cling to the intestine. And through these hooks, they not only cling, but also produce a little tiny wounds in the intestine, which bleed, and then the hookworms feed on that blood. So these are some of the common situations in which the anemia may be because of an abnormal loss of blood. Now we come to another disease closely related to the red cells, and that is jaundice. Jaundice, is because of the accumulation of one of the products of the destruction of red cells, and that is bilirubin. So as we saw, the lifespan of a red blood cell is about 120 days. And one of the products of the destruction is bilirubin. Bilirubin is processed in the liver and excreted by the gallbladder. And accumulation of bilirubin in the blood leads to jaundice. Let's try and see it a little more in a pictorial fashion. So the red cell breakdown, one of the products is bilirubin, and this bilirubin is then picked up by the liver, processed in the liver, and then excreted into the gallbladder. And from the gallbladder, it moves down the tube into the small intestine. And after reaching the small intestine, uh, it is lost in feces. Some of it may, of course, get absorbed and enter the general circulation and may be lost in the urine. But then the yellow color of the stool is primarily because of bilirubin. So bilirubin is a yellow colored dye. Now, if that is how bilirubin is handled in the body, one can easily understand what is it that might lead to jaundice. Again, logically, one of the reasons could be that there's an excessive breakdown of red blood cells. They're breaking down in a very large number, and therefore the amount of bilirubin that is formed is much more than normal, and the liver can't handle it. So some of it will accumulate in the blood. This backlog will keep collecting because the liver can't take up as much bilirubin as is being formed, and this excess is being formed because the RBCs are breaking down much more than they normally do. So excessive breakdown of red cells would not only lead to anemia, it would also can also lead to jaundice because bilirubin may be produced maybe so much that the liver can't process it, take it up and process it, and so the backlog builds up in the blood. Now, bilirubin is not only taken up by the liver, it's also processed by the liver. So if the liver itself is defective, that would again leave bilirubin in the blood, and it will not be able to pick up enough. So again, the backlog of bilirubin will build up in the blood because the liver is not able to pick up. So the amount of bilirubin found may be normal, but because the liver itself is defective, it can't pick up the normal amounts of bilirubin, and therefore a backlog again builds up in the blood, and this is the second reason why there might be jaundice. So the first one, excessive RBC breakdown, is what is called hemolytic jaundice. Lytic, is breakdown. Lysis is breaking down. So hemolytic jaundice is due to excessive breakdown of red blood cells. And the second one, if it is due to the liver being defective, is hepatic jaundice, because hepatic refers to the liver, and here the liver is defective. For example, in hepatitis. And the third reason why there may be jaundice is because there's an obstruction somewhere in the gallbladder because of stones in the gallbladder or stones in the gallbladder duct, or cancer of the gallbladder, or cancer of the head of the pancreas, which presses on the duct here, the pancreas. This tube coming from the gallbladder opens in the part of the intestine that we call the duodenum, immediately after the stomach. It's a C-shaped loop, and nestled in this C is the pancreas. So if there's a cancer of the pancreas, that would also press on this tube and lead to the same type of obstruction. So, but the commonest cause of obstruction is stones in the gallbladder. And the result would be that once again, bilirubin would build up in the liver, and from liver spill over into the general circulation and give rise to jaundice. Now you can see there can be two types of bilirubin that may collect in the blood. In case of excessive breakdown and in case of liver disease, the bilirubin that collects is the one which has not yet been processed by the liver. In one case, the liver has not been able to process it because the too much is being formed. In another case, it has not been processed by the liver because the liver is defective. But in the third situation, the liver has processed it, and therefore the type of bilirubin that will accumulate is the one which has been already processed by the liver. And these two different types of bilirubin is what is called direct and indirect bilirubin, and that is what you see in your report sometimes. Total bilirubin this much, direct this much, indirect this much. So these two types of bilirubin, why there are two types, now you can understand. Okay. Now turning to the white blood cells. The total count, which is generally called the TLC, is 4,000 to 11,000. These days, you don't really have to remember all these figures because in the lab reports, you have the normal range given. And along with that, what your report is, and if it is only even slightly different from the normal range, it is printed in bold. Why I emphasized slightly was because a slight difference is not necessarily significant. But then, it's an automated process, and therefore, if the machine has been told that a neutrophil count of less than 40% is abnormal, then even if it is 39, it will show it in bold. So that is where your own judgment comes in. So anyway, so coming back to the differential leukocyte count, or DLC, of all the white blood cells, 40 to 75% are neutrophils, 20 to 45% lymphocytes, 2 to 10% monocytes, 1 to 6% eosinophils, and 0 to 1% basophils. Now, 0 does not mean that the person doesn't have any basophils. What it means is that in the area that was counted, no basophil was detected, because the number is so small that one may not detect the basophil. But if one examines a much larger area or more fields under the microscope, sooner or later some basophils would be seen. Now, what are the functions of these different types of cells? The neutrophils are phagocytes. They eat up germs and other undesirable substances, and therefore their number goes up in infections, particularly those infections which are acute, which are called pyogenic, which may produce pus. These are the type of infections in which neutrophil count goes up. It also goes up when there's excessive tissue breakdown, as in case of, say, myocardial infarction, that is a heart attack in which a significant amount of muscle tissue in the heart has died, and then also the neutrophil count goes up. And it doesn't necessarily go up because a larger number of neutrophils is being manufactured. Apart from the neutrophils that circulate, there's quite a bit held in reserve, and this reserve is then sent into the circulation in any situation where they are needed in a large number. So when they are needed, and in case of dead tissue also, again, they are needed to clear the debris. So whenever they are needed, the reserves can be called upon. Eosinophils generally increase in number in allergies, and one of the hypotheses is that they reduce the ferocity of the allergic reaction. The allergic reaction would be much more intense if the eosinophils were not there. The second situation in which they increase is in case of parasitic infestations, that is large infections by large organisms like, say, worms. Now, worms are too big to be phagocytosed by cells like neutrophils, but what eosinophils can do is to stick on the surface of these worms, these parasites, and kill them. So the eosinophil acts like a snake for these. So it just gives its stings. Through its sting, it can kill those worms. So that is one of the so these are the two situations in which they are very useful, and we know what their function is. And this corresponds to these two functions: reducing the ferocity of the allergic reactions and taking care of parasitic infestations. So in parasitic infections like worms, etc., and in allergies, the eosinophil count is high. Basophils, their function is somewhat obscure, but they seem to be important participants in the healing mechanisms. They contain granules. They are jam-packed with blue granules which contain histamine, and the histamine that they release can produce itching, and that is what explains the itching that you experience in the skin when the skin is about to heal. Initially, the wound may be painful. After that, there's neither pain nor anything. It's just healing. But then when the healing is at its peak, that is when it may start itching. The monocytes are again phagocytes, but then they act as phagocytes when they enter the tissues, not in the blood itself. So they enter the tissues and act as phagocytes. We'll talk a little more about them when we come to the immune system. And lymphocytes, again, we'll talk in detail when we come to the immune system. And The lymphocytes are primarily the cells of the immune system. And that we shall talk about in the next session, which will be on Friday, next theory session. Then the platelet count. The count we have seen is about 2 lakhs per cubic millimeter. And the functions of the platelets are, when there is a wound, the first line of defense is that there's a constriction of blood vessels. The blood vessels become narrow. And this is because of the release of constricting substances from the platelets. Then there is the formation of a platelet plug. That is, the platelets themselves form a sort of a plug which seals the opening, closes the breach that has resulted from this injury. So there's formation of a platelet plug. But this platelet plug is not something which is very dependable and reliable for stopping the bleeding. The process of clotting is initiated, and platelets help also in the process of clotting. And when a proper clot has been formed, then only one can be a little more sure of the bleeding stopping. And a clot is essentially a large number of red cells caught in a web of blood cells, and blood cells are mostly red cells. So the blood cells, which will be predominantly red blood cells, caught in a web of threads which are formed by a protein called fibrinogen, which is converted into fibrin in the process of clotting. So there's a sort of a weaving of these fibrin fibers in a crisscross manner, which binds a large number of blood cells together. But then these threads that have wrapped around this collection of blood need to be tightened for the clot to become firm and smaller. And that tightening is once again a result of a chemical released from the platelets. So the platelets participate in all aspects of prevention of bleeding from a wound, starting with the initial constriction and the final retraction of the clot. And that is why when a person's platelet count goes down, there's a tendency to bleed. Tendency to bleed under the skin, tendency to bleed inside the body from internal organs, which is much more risky and not so obvious. And these are the risks of a low platelet count leading to excessive bleeding. We'll wait for this gardener's equipment. I believe now I should be audible. Now we come to another subject of popular interest, and that is blood groups. Now, each red cell has on its surface some characteristic proteins, which we may call antigens. Antigen is a protein which is capable of giving rise to an antibody, or which evokes the production of an antibody. Antibody is a protein which circulates in the plasma and has a structure which is complementary to the antigen, so that the antigen and the antibody can enter into a lock and key type of relationship. So there can be a lock and key type of an attachment between the antigen and the antibody. So these are the red cells, and say this is the antigen on the surface of the red cells. Then corresponding to this antigen, the antibodies would be somewhat like this. I mean, pictorially represented like this to facilitate understanding. So if this antigen is a triangular shape, there will be a triangular hollow in the antibody so that they can fit into each other like a lock and a key. Now imagine this type of red cells present in the same, suspended in the same plasma, which has this type of antibodies. What would be the result? The result would be that these red cells will form a clump like this. And this clump is of no use in the circulation. It will block the blood vessels and lead to circulatory problems. And in case of vital organs like the heart or the lungs, this type of clumping in the vessels which supply the blood would lead to death. So this type of clumping of red cells is not desirable. And therefore, we find that if the red cells have a particular type of antigen on their surface, the corresponding antibody is not present in the blood of the same person. Okay, the person does not have this type of antibodies. Now, the antigens on the red cells are of two types, A and B. And corresponding to this, there are two different types of antibodies, which we may call anti-A and anti-B. And therefore, you can now understand that the person who has A type of antigens on the red cells should not have anti-A antibodies in the blood, and a person who has B type of antigen on the surface of the red cells should not have anti-B type of antibodies in the plasma. Now, corresponding to this, we have these four blood groups. If the antigen on the red cell is of the A type, the person belongs to blood group A. If the antigen is of the B type, then the person's blood group is B. If the person has both types of antigens, then the person's blood group is AB. And if the person has no antigen on the red cells, then the person has blood group O. Now, in case of the person who has antigen of the A variety on the red cell surface, the type of antibody that is present is anti-B, because these two will not interact with each other, and therefore these red cells will not clump. In case of if the person has B type of antigen on the red cells, the antibody in the plasma is anti-A. If the person has both A and B type of antigens on the red cell surface, the person has neither anti-A nor anti-B, no antibodies of this type in the blood. And if the person has no antigen on the surface of the red cells, the person has both anti-A and anti-B in the plasma. So the person who has a combination of antigen A on the red cell surface, anti-B type of antibodies in the plasma, is said to have blood group A. The person who has B type of antigen on the red cell surface, anti-A type of antibodies in the plasma, this person's blood group is B. When the person has both antigen A and B on the red cell surface, no antibodies of neither anti-A nor anti-B in the plasma, then the person's blood group is AB. And if the person has neither A nor B on the surface and both anti-A and anti-B in the plasma, the person's blood group is O. Now we'll go to a few suggested readings and then open to questions and answers. I've added one more beautiful book to the suggested reading list, Principles of Anatomy and Physiology by Tortora and Grabowski. Probably the latest edition has been, in the latest edition, Tortora has been joined by others as well. So, but anyway, this is a classic, Principles of Anatomy and Physiology, now probably running into its 14th edition. It's rather fat, more than 1,000 pages, but it's an excellent book. Very well illustrated, beautiful pictures, and well, also, of course, beautiful text. And nearer home, you have this book, which is nearly 30-year-old now, but updated from time to time. The latest edition is 2018, The Human Machine. This is addressed to the general public and published by the National Book Trust, which publishes only popular science books, not textbooks. These are textbooks. Textbooks about 400 pages long, Fundamentals of Physiology, and about 1,000 pages, Understanding Medical Physiology. And then we have these wiki books, Human Anatomy, Human Physiology, and another work in progress, more and more books being added under the health science heading. And here you have two books for free download from Dr. John Campbell, one on physiology and one on pathophysiology. This is the place where I stay and work. If you have any questions or comments, please drop an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. And gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there. Before we open ourselves to questions, I'll tell you something about the class day after tomorrow. Tomorrow, Wednesday, there's no class. On Thursday, there will be a practical class. But those of you who have not gone into the plan behind these courses, for them, I would like to say that in this course, we have primarily 4 modules, and we are on the 3rd one. And the aim of these 4 modules put together is to enable you to become yoga teachers. And therefore, in this module, the practical classes will go beyond what we have already done in the previous 2 modules. The first module, we did course the practices which are elementary and were conducted in such a way that they to enable you to do the physical practices for yourself to keep yourself fit. In the second module, we went a little further and tried to go one step towards becoming yoga teachers. In Yes.03, we'll go yet one more step towards becoming yoga teachers. And therefore, in the practical class day after tomorrow, do not immediately sort of unroll your mats and start copying what the teacher is doing if you do not have enough practice already. Because then some of those practices could injure you. The pace of which they are conducted may be too fast for you. If you are still just beginning in the physical practices, then the best thing would be to go to the class recordings, the practical class recordings of the Yes.01 course, Yes.01, the first module. The class recordings are available on YouTube on the same channel on which these class recordings are being put in a separate playlist, class recordings of Yes.01 practicals. So that has 7 or 8 videos. Start with the first one and keep going further. Those are the videos that would help you practice these things with enough guidance safely and enable you to do these practices to keep yourself fit. Okay. In this module, the practices will not be along those lines. If you are doing them regularly and you feel confident, you can copy, but otherwise you don't have to try and copy while the class is going on.
We will move to the question answers now. The first question is how to get adequate B12 in a vegetarian diet without supplements.
That's a good question. And the answer which can be given with certainty is better take a supplement. If you are a vegetarian who does not take even milk and milk products, then take a supplement. Otherwise, milk and milk products are the source of vitamin B12 in a vegetarian diet. In India, we consider milk to be essentially vegetarian, and most people who are vegetarian do consume milk and milk products, and that's what supplies their vitamin B12.
Do expecting mother who are on thyroid medication increase the risk of jaundice in their children? What can be done here?
I'm not sure if a woman who has a thyroid problem is more likely to have a child who will have jaundice. There may be some such association, but I'm not aware of it. But the important thing is that a woman need not remain thyroid deficient during pregnancy. We can supply thyroxine from outside, and that is a treatment that should continue even during pregnancy. So with that, probably should not increase the possibility of any type of defect because of the thyroid deficiency in the mother. So mother's thyroid deficiency should not give any abnormality in the fetus if the woman is taking proper treatment for this thyroid deficiency. So far as the jaundice in the newborn is concerned, It's rare, but it is not unknown, more common in premature infants. And the major reason for this is that the liver is still not sufficiently mature. We saw that the liver picks up the bilirubin and processes it. So if the liver is not sufficiently mature, then particularly in a premature infant, that would be the case. Then the liver cannot pick up enough of the bilirubin. Some backlog would build up in the blood, and that's what gives the jaundice of the newborn. And because it is considered essentially normal, it's sometimes also called physiological jaundice.
What happens to bilirubin in case of a person who has a gallbladder removal surgery?
Yes, the gallbladder is removed, but the gallbladder stores the bile. Uh, the continuity between the liver and the duct is still maintained. So that's how the person after gallbladder surgery does not really get jaundice.
How do you prevent or cure excessive breakdown in RBC?
The treatment depends upon the cause. It will depend upon what the cause for excessive destruction is. And some of the causes would disappear with time. For example, if there's a snake bite, one has to take care of the immediate effects, but then sooner or later this will be got rid of, handled by the body, got rid of by the body. If it is due to a drug, again, if one stops the drug, the body will gradually take care of the drug, and then the reason for the excessive destruction is gone. Some situations may not be so simple. If there are antibodies which are affecting, going to the very root and affecting the red cells, then the situation could be different. So it will depend upon the cause.
What is the function of antigens and antibodies?
Well, that's a broad question. We'll talk about it when we come to the immune system. The function is to protect us. And that's why we have this system. In case of blood groups, there's no really good reason why the antibody should be present at all. So person has blood group A, and then the person should not have anti-A in the blood. That is understandable. But why the person should have anti-B, there is no logical explanation for that. And that is the type of situation we find in the Rh blood group. If a person has Rh antigen on the surface of the red cells, the person is Rh positive, but the person does not have Rh antibodies. Sorry, the person who is Rh negative does not have Rh antigen on the surface of the blood, but Rh negative individuals normally do not have Rh antibodies. So why in case of AB, if an antigen is absent, why the corresponding antibody is present? For that, there's no logical explanation. That doesn't apply to the Rh groups, where the absence of the antigen does not necessarily mean that the antibody will be present. But then now that we have come to it, let's talk a little bit about the Rh group. The Rh blood group is independent of the AB blood group. Most people are Rh positive, but there are a few Rh negative individuals, and they do not have Rh antibodies in their blood. But these antibodies can be induced. If this person gets a blood transfusion, which is from an Rh positive individual, and that is quite possible because majority of the people are Rh positive, and this may not be taken into account while matching the blood for blood transfusion, this person can develop Rh antibodies. Normally, it doesn't matter too much, but this can become a serious issue in young women who are still or girls and young women who are still not sort of completed their reproductive life. How the rate goes is something like this: that suppose the woman is Rh negative and she receives an Rh positive blood. Now, this Rh positive blood will give rise to Rh antibodies in her blood. Now, if she gets pregnant, chances are that she'll have an Rh positive baby, because most people are Rh positive. Her husband would be Rh positive, and therefore her baby would also be Rh positive. And then what can happen is that the Rh positive antibodies in her blood, which developed because of a blood transfusion, may cross the placenta, get into the circulation of the baby, and start destroying the baby's own red blood cells, which are Rh positive. And that is what can give rise to jaundice. But then it involves many ifs and buts. For that, the placenta has to let these antibodies pass, which doesn't always happen. Secondly, for the antibodies, when these antibodies enter, they get diluted in a large amount of plasma in the baby's blood, and therefore nothing may happen. Another thing is that the antibodies were evoked long back during a transfusion, so they need a reminder. And this reminder itself often comes from the baby. That is, the baby's red cells have to also cross the placenta, get into the maternal circulation to evoke a brisk and strong antibody response. And then these antibodies have to return to the baby. So for this two-way traffic to take place, it takes time. And by that time, the baby has been delivered. And therefore, the chances of anything going wrong with the first pregnancy are very small. But once this reminder has been given in one pregnancy, the chances of something going wrong in the second pregnancy increase much more. And therefore, as a principle, a woman, when she is given a blood transfusion, a girl or a woman, when she is given a blood transfusion, if she is Rh negative, she is given Rh negative blood. She is not given Rh positive blood.
Is it better to go to the lab and do health checks or use home collection of blood, most popular nowadays?
I don't think it should really make much of a difference. Home collection is much more convenient, and I don't really see anything wrong with it, because the transport of the blood to the lab is still done in conditions which will not lead to any further deterioration or change in the blood sample.
I would like to ask you that fasting in silence, how it helps for blood function.
Well, I mean, fasting and silence are two sort of broad subjects which make some sort of austerities which are often associated with the spiritual life. Not absolutely essential, but all the same, that association does exist in our minds. If I may digress a bit, I mean, in Sri Aurobindo's and the Mother's Integral Yoga, none of these austerities are compulsory. They're not forbidden, but they're not compulsory. And in fact, the view taken is that we have to go behind the reason for these practices, the spirit behind these practices, rather than their absolute form that they take. For example, fasting, not taking food for a limited period of time. It is to overcome attachment to food. But if that attachment has not been overcome within, while the person is fasting, the person is still thinking about food and thinking of what he will have when the fast is broken. In the same way, the person is observing total silence for a limited period of time, and he's just waiting for the time when he'll be able to speak again. Again, the silent period of silence has not served much purpose. And therefore, the attitude taken is that instead of a total fast, eat all the time, only as much as you need, and be happy with what you get. Be not attached to tasty food, but at the same time, neither give up food altogether nor give up tasty food if it will lead to thinking about the food or the tasty food all the same. The same way about silence, the mother has said that it's much easier to remain totally silent for a limited period of time than to speak only as much as necessary all the time. So that would be a better austerity than observing total silence for a fixed period of time. Of course, your question was not this. The question was how it affects blood. Probably what you are thinking is that these practices will in some way affect blood more than the rest of the bodily functions. Well, I don't really see any reason why it should affect the blood more than other bodily functions, except that blood mirrors the function of the other parts of the body. So there may be some changes which are mirroring the changes elsewhere. But again, that would depend upon the mind-body connection rather than on this, which means what is going on in the mind is what would influence the body, and that in turn may sometimes get reflected in the blood. But apart from that, there's no direct link between these practices and the blood. Of course, fasting, yes, one might say that may increase the levels of certain hormones which increase in fasting, like in the steroid hormones, which would mobilize the reserves of different fuels, or and so on. So those types of changes could be there. Or say with prolonged fasting could increase the ketone levels if the person goes into ketosis. So those type of changes, but then they don't have sort of an application when it comes to an average healthy person who just wants to stay healthy.
Why do we sometimes taste bile? Is it indicative of any issue with the liver function? What is meant by fatty liver?
Now, there are at least two questions there. One is, why do we sometimes taste bile? I'm not sure whether we taste bile. What we taste is what comes from the stomach. And from the stomach, we get acid. So that can happen when there is, normally it should not happen, but there's a junction, the junction between the food pipe or the esophagus and the stomach that can sometimes let a bit of acid go up into the food pipe, what we call reflux. And that is what we may taste. I'm not sure if the bile would travel all that long distance from the small intestine up to the mouth so that we can taste the bile. Doubt if that happens. The second question is, what is fatty liver? Fatty liver is essentially a lifestyle disease, and it accompanies, it's a part of a cluster and that of other lifestyle diseases. Out of all the lifestyle diseases which form that cluster, which one will be more prominent, which will happen first, which will be more severe, and which will remain mild or subclinical? Those are things which will depend upon the genetic makeup of the person to a large extent, because that is what determines which are the weak points in our body. So with the same type of lifestyle mistakes, one person may get high blood pressure, another may get peptic ulcer, and the third one may get a fatty liver. But to some extent, all these things would happen in most of us if the lifestyle is faulty. So it's essentially a result of a faulty lifestyle.
How do we take care of excess bilirubin if we don't want to remove gallbladder with stones?
What you're assuming is that the high levels of bilirubin are because of gallbladder stones. If that is so, then the excess bilirubin which is collecting is the one which is going back from the liver into the circulation. And that is type of bilirubin that is water soluble and therefore can go in the urine. And therefore, we don't really have to do too much about it. And that's why in obstructive jaundice, what we get is clay-colored stools and deep yellow urine. So the urine becomes deep yellow because that is taking care of quite a bit of the excretion of bilirubin. And the stools become clay-colored because no bilirubin is entering the intestines and getting into the stool.
How yoga impact the physiology of blood?
Well, it's better to look at the things from a more holistic perspective than to look at one system at a time. Just as we are looking at yoga in a holistic manner as something which goes beyond physical practices, when it comes to the body, again, let us try and see what yoga in that comprehensive sense does to the body as a whole. If we said it affects the blood because it brings down the blood cholesterol, that is only a reflection of what is happening at many places in the body, because reduction in blood cholesterol is not because something is happening in the blood, but it is because what is happening elsewhere, which is getting reflected in the blood cholesterol levels. So if the person has, as a result of this practice, has lost weight, that is what has brought down the blood cholesterol, not because something changed specifically in the blood itself. Blood is only a mirror.
What happens to the toxic blood if a woman has had hysterectomy? How does it impact health in the long run?
Firstly, why are you assuming that a woman who has undergone hysterectomy had toxic blood? And I don't know what really is meant by toxic blood. Most of the time, actually, when we talk of detoxification, it is used in a rather general sense and vague sense. When a person says that I'm going for detoxification, uh, the person is not really going for the removal of any specific toxins which have been identified and measured by anybody. So just as we say we can detoxify our mind, we are not talking of a chemical called chemically identified toxin. We are talking about the negativities of the mind. In the same way, when we say we are getting detoxification of the body, that again is talking of certain negativities in general, which have weakened the body, and we are going some sort of a rejuvenation. And therefore, to assume that woman who has undergone hysterectomy had toxic blood, firstly, I mean, why connect the two? And secondly, hysterectomy, there must be some indications for that hysterectomy. And uh, how it affects the health, that would depend upon why it was done. Say it was done for fibroids or something, which is one of the common indications. Then certainly the woman would be grateful because the excessive bleeding would stop. And some of the effects would depend upon whether, along with that, the ovaries also were removed or had to be removed or could be easily left behind. That would determine to some extent what happens after the hysterectomy. Because if the ovaries are left behind, then the person may not experience any changes. If the ovaries were removed, then the person could experience menopausal symptoms.
All right, if there are no more questions, we can close today's session. I had shared the playlist of Yes.01 videos in the chat earlier. You can also visit the channel and look at the videos before the practical class on Thursday. Just remember, tomorrow we don't have a class, and Thursday we have the practical class. So thank you once again, everyone. We end with a minute of silence.